There are books that frighten you while you read them, and then there are books that frighten history itself. Books that do not whisper horror, but authorize it. Books that do not imagine evil, but give it ink, a seal, and permission. This is not a story about demons crawling out of the dark. This is a story about a book that taught ordinary people how to see demons everywhere, how to name them, how to hunt them, how to burn them alive, and how to sleep at night afterward. This book did not summon demons. It created them. Not in forests, not in shadows, but in neighbors, in widows, in midwives, in daughters, in women who spoke too much or too little, in men who were weak, in bodies that did not obey authority. This book had a title heavy as iron and sharp as a blade. Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. And once it was written, the world learned how to swing it. There was no curse inside its pages, no spells, no blood rituals. There was something far worse. There was structure, there was certainty, there was divine approval. And once fear is organized, it does not need monsters anymore. It becomes one. The 15th century was not an age of darkness, but an age of anxiety, an age where the world felt unstable, where plagues had taught people that death could arrive without warning, where wars had shown that God did not always protect the faithful, where the church itself felt its authority slipping like sand through clenched fingers. People needed explanations. They needed enemies. They needed reasons why crops failed, why children died, why bodies betrayed them with illness and desire. And into this trembling world stepped two men who believed they had found the answer, not in compassion, but in control. Heinrich Kramer, also known as Institorus, was an inquisitor obsessed with witches, not as symbols, but as an epidemic. He believed witchcraft was not superstition, but conspiracy, and that disbelief itself was proof of corruption. When local bishops questioned his methods, when communities resisted his trials, when women were acquitted despite his accusations, Kramer did not retreat. He wrote a book. He wrote it not as a plea, but as a verdict. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1487, printed and reprinted across Europe at a time when the printing press was turning ideas into weapons faster than armies could march. This was not a theological debate. This was a manual. It explained who witches were, why they were mostly women, how they made pacts with the devil, how they caused storms, impotence, miscarriages, and madness, and most importantly, how to identify them, interrogate them, and execute them without mercy or doubt. The book wrapped its cruelty in scripture. It quoted authorities. It anticipated objections and crushed them. It told judges that compassion was weakness. It told priests that skepticism was heresy. It told society that mercy itself was a sin if it allowed evil to live. And the most dangerous thing it did was this: it made killing feel righteous. The accused did not need evidence. They needed suspicion. The system did not need proof. It needed confession. And confession could always be obtained, because pain speaks the language fear understands. The book argued that witches would lie, that denial was expected, that innocence itself was a mask. That meant torture was not cruelty, it was revelation. Each scream was interpreted as resistance, each silence was guilt, each death was justice. And once this logic was accepted, no one was safe. Not the poor, not the pious, not the obedient. The book taught readers to see patterns where there were none, to see intention in coincidence, to see malice in misfortune. If a cow died, look at the woman who argued with its owner. If a child fell ill, look at the midwife. If a man felt desire he could not control, look at the woman who rejected him. The Malleus did not create fear out of nothing. It harvested it, sharpened it, and gave it rules. This is why it spread so fast, because it told people what they already wanted to believe, that suffering had a human face, and that destroying that face would bring order back to the world. It turned anxiety into authority. It turned rumor into law. And once law learns to hate, it does not stop at witches. It learns how to hunt anyone who does not fit. The book never said it hated women. It didn't have to. It simply explained them. It described them as weaker in faith, looser in morals, more vulnerable to temptation, more likely to listen when the devil whispered promises into the cracks of their lives. It dressed prejudice as theology and biology as destiny. Women, according to the Malleus, were incomplete men, unfinished vessels, creatures of flesh before spirit, and therefore perfect doorways for evil. This idea was not new, but the book sharpened it into doctrine. It told judges that most witches were women not because society oppressed them, but because nature itself had betrayed them. And once belief wears the mask of nature, it becomes untouchable. The most dangerous women were not powerful queens or open rebels. They were the quiet ones, the old ones, the poor ones, the ones who lived alone, the ones who knew herbs, the ones who helped deliver children into the world and watched many of them die anyway. Midwives were especially feared because they stood at the boundary between life and death, and boundaries terrify institutions. They see too much. They know too much. They cannot be fully controlled. When childbirth failed, when infants were stillborn, when mothers bled out on straw beds, someone had to be blamed. And the Malleus provided the answer with terrifying clarity. These women were not healers. They were killers in disguise. Not grieving mothers, they were accomplices to Satan. The book claimed witches murdered infants and offered them to the devil. It claimed they stole male virility, that they caused impotence and madness, that they turned desire into weakness. This mattered because it turned private shame into public accusation. A man who failed in bed did not need to question his own body. He could point. A community facing famine did not need to confront bad harvests or poor leadership. They could burn a woman and feel restored. Power loves explanations that cost it nothing, and women paid the price. Burned bodies became proof. Burned bodies became reassurance. Burned bodies told survivors that the system worked. Every execution rewrote memory. The victim was no longer a neighbor. She became a threat that had been stopped. And the more women burned, the more real witchcraft felt. Fear feeds on repetition. The book did not just describe witches. It taught society how to manufacture them. Once accusation began, the ending was already written. The Malleus laid out interrogation not as a search for truth, but as a ritual of inevitability. It warned judges that witches would lie. It insisted that denial meant guilt. It instructed them to isolate the accused, strip them, search their bodies for marks left by the devil, any scar, any blemish, any place that did not bleed when pierced. This was called evidence, and if evidence failed, torture would succeed. Pain was not a last resort, it was a method. The book argued that witches felt less pain, that endurance itself was suspicious, that screaming too loudly meant deception, and silence meant stubborn evil. There was no correct response. The body was trapped in a logic designed to break it. Confession became a mechanical outcome. Pull hard enough, and it appears. And once a confession was extracted, it never stood alone. The accused was pressured to name others. This was not about justice. It was about expansion. Each name fed the fire. Each accusation validated the system. Witch hunts did not move like storms. They moved like infections. They spread through fear and trust equally. Because the accusation almost always came from someone you knew, someone you shared bread with, someone who needed to survive one more night. And under torture, truth becomes irrelevant. The mind will say anything to stop the pain. It will invent memories. It will accept scripts given by interrogators. It will agree to crimes that never happened, because imaginary guilt hurts less than real agony. The Malleus anticipated this and welcomed it. False confessions did not threaten its authority, they confirmed it. The book taught that witches were liars, so contradictions were expected. That meant the system could never be wrong. If the accused confessed, it proved guilt. If they recanted, it proved deception. If they died, it proved justice. And society watched this and learned. The lesson was simple and terrifying. Authority does not need truth when it controls interpretation.
Once pain becomes proof, anyone can be guilty. And once guilt becomes flexible, death becomes easy. The most lethal thing about the Malleus Maleficarum was not its violence, but its legitimacy. It was not a banned book. It was not a secret text passed hand to hand in shadows. It was printed, approved, quoted, and treated as authority. In courts that barely understood theology, it became theology. In villages that barely understood law, it became law. Judges who had never seen a witch now knew exactly what one looked like, because the book had drawn the outline for them. It told them how witches behaved, how they spoke, how they resisted, how they cried. It gave fear a uniform. Once fear puts on a uniform, it can walk openly in daylight. The hunts did not explode everywhere at once. They grew slowly, methodically, case by case, trial by trial. But each trial lowered the threshold for the next. What once seemed unthinkable became procedural. The extraordinary became routine. The burning of a body became paperwork, and communities adjusted. They learned how to survive suspicion. They learned how to accuse first. They learned that silence could be dangerous, and difference could be fatal. The Malleus did not need to be enforced everywhere to be effective. It only needed to exist, to loom, to be cited, to remind people that the system had teeth. This is how terror becomes self-sustaining. People begin to police each other. Neighbors become witnesses. Friends become informants. Not because they are cruel, but because they are afraid. And fear does not require hatred. It only requires uncertainty. The book thrived in places where crops failed, where disease lingered, where authority felt distant or weak. Because in those places, certainty is a drug, and the Malleus offered certainty with blood-red clarity. It told people who to blame. It told leaders how to act. It told the church that doubt was dangerous. It told the state that mercy was weakness. And once fear was written into procedure, removing it became almost impossible. You could end a hunt, but not the logic behind it. The idea remained.
that evil has a face, that it hides among us, that it must be destroyed before it destroys us. This idea did not die with the last execution. It simply learned to change its name. Eventually, the fires slowed. Not because the book was discredited, not because justice prevailed, but because society changed. New doubts replaced old certainties. Power found new enemies. Science offered explanations that demons no longer could. But the logic of the Malleus survived. It slipped quietly into the foundations of modern fear. The belief that guilt can exist without evidence, that accusation is a form of proof, that suffering reveals truth, that safety requires sacrifice, not of ideas, but of people. This is why the book still matters. It is easy to dismiss it as medieval madness, to lock it in a museum of superstition and move on. But the Malleus was not an accident. It was a blueprint. It showed how authority can weaponize belief, how institutions can turn anxiety into violence, how language can turn murder into duty. It killed thousands directly, but it taught millions how to accept killing indirectly. This book did not summon demons. It taught humans how to become them calmly, legally, and with conviction. And that is why its shadow is longer than its pages. Because the most dangerous books are not the ones that imagine monsters. They're the ones that explain why monsters are necessary.